All right, so welcome to the deep dive, and today we're going west.
Going west.
We're going to take a deep dive into the history of the American West.
Excellent.
Our listener has given us a bunch of sources, and one that I'm really excited to get into is the American Yawp. I know you're familiar with this one.
Yes, a collaborative history of the United States.
Yeah, it's really cool. I think our listener is really trying to get us to go kind of beyond the romanticized notions of cowboys and Indians, Hollywood, things like that,
Yeah,
and get to some of the real nitty-gritty about westward expansion.
that's right. And I think you'll be surprised by what we find because the West is much more than just gold rushes and gunfights, as exciting as those things are, but it's also a period of massive social, economic, and cultural change. And it had lasting impacts that we still feel to this day.
Yeah, I mean, even thinking about today, we're recording this in California. I mean, it's impossible to, I think, be in California and not think about, how California came to be, which is directly related to westward expansion.
Yeah.
So the American Yawp starts by kind of painting a picture of the pre-Civil War West. And it's pretty eye-opening, actually, because it talks about how the West wasn't just, an empty frontier waiting to be settled, but that it was dominated by all these different Native American groups who were already integrated into diverse regional economies. So I'm thinking, okay, so that kind of challenges the image of this Wild West as this unified thing.
Well, if you think about it, what is the West? I mean, we kind of think of it as this homogenous thing. And when you really break it down and look at the geography and the terrain, it's so varied. It's deserts and mountains and plains and forests. I mean, so it stands to reason that different groups would have adapted to those different environments and therefore, developed their own cultural characteristics and even their own economies in a way.
Right. And I think, when we think of history, we often think of, especially like in school, it's presented as a series of like, major events, big battles. But the reality is like life is so much more, just the day to day. How do we survive? What are
Yeah.
we eating? What are our traditions? What are our belief systems? And so I think you're right. The West was probably so diverse. And then on top of that, you have all these different Native American groups, and they're not just like isolated, they're actually integrated into these economies.
Yeah, they're trading with each other, they're fighting with each other,
Yeah.
they're interacting in very sophisticated ways.
And, they're also dealing with, to some extent, European powers who are kind of encroaching, but not to the extent that they will in the post-Civil War period.
Well, that's right, and that's where things get interesting because the American Yawp makes the argument that the Civil War itself served as this kind of catalyst for westward expansion.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So you can imagine the war ends, right? You have the end of slavery, you have this massive industrialization happening in the US, and there's this huge demand for resources, for land, for new markets. And the West, with its like vast untapped potential, looks like the solution. It's right there, wide open. So it's not a coincidence that this huge push westward starts happening right after the Civil War.
So it's almost like the country was, I don't know, bursting at the seams and needed this release valve. Like, okay, we've got to go somewhere. We need more resources. We need more land. We need more opportunities. The West was calling.
Exactly. Manifest Destiny 2.0.
Manifest destiny. Oh, yeah. That's a great point. And speaking of opportunity, of course, everyone always thinks about the gold rush. You go west to strike it rich. But, I mean, the American Yawp is really, pointing out all these other, I guess, lesser-known motivations for why people are going west. And one of the ones that really stood out to me was the bison hide industry. Like, I knew that, bison were hunted, but just the scale. I mean, we're talking about millions of bison being slaughtered.
Mm.
And not just for food, but for their hides to supply, this booming clothing industry in the East. I mean, it's almost unfathomable, the number.
It is unfathomable, the number. They were leaving behind these mountains of skulls. You see pictures of this, and it's just incredible, the impact. And of course, this is not just an economic activity. This is completely changing the culture and ecology of the West.
Right.
For the Native American tribes that depended on bison for everything. I mean, this is their way of life being destroyed.
And I think, if anyone's ever seen a bison in person,
Hmm.
they are massive animals.
They're huge.
And so to think about that many being killed,
Mm.
and it just shows, I don't know, the demand. Like the demand must have just been off the charts for bison hide.
Right, and it tells you something about, industrialization in the East.
Right.
And the fact that they needed all this material to make belts for machinery and clothing and all sorts of things. So it's really a fascinating story, but it's also a very tragic story when you look at the impact it had on Native Americans.
Yeah. And then you have, of course, other groups going west. And the American Yawp mentions, the Mormons, for example, fleeing religious persecution,
Hmm.
heading west in their wagon trains, and they actually play this kind of unique role as suppliers for other travelers.
Yeah.
So you got these groups almost like, inadvertently building a new society.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to think about the Mormons. I mean, here you have a group that is actively fleeing persecution, right? So they have very different motivations than some of these other groups. But they're also very entrepreneurial. They see an opportunity to provide goods and services to these other travelers who are coming through. And they're also, very focused on building a community. I mean, Brigham Young was a very kind of strong leader who had this vision of creating a thriving agricultural community out in the Utah desert.
And not just a community. They were trying to build like a whole, like a new society almost.
Right.
And they did. I mean, Salt Lake City is testament to that.
Absolutely. And they had, their own unique practices that set them apart, like polygamy, the practice of having multiple wives. That, of course, led to a lot of conflict with the U.S. government. It's a really fascinating story of, this group that is both trying to fit in some ways, but also maintain their distinct identity.
Yeah. So you've got, the Mormons, you've got people going for gold, you've got people, supplying the bison hide industry. And then on top of all that, you have the Homestead Act, which, the American Yawp really emphasizes how this was like a major turning point. This idea that the government's basically saying like, come west,
Right.
free land, all you got to do is work it for 5 years. And that completely changes the landscape. But it's interesting because like married women couldn't file claims on their own. You see how even in this opportunity, there's still these inequalities built in.
Well, and that's one of the things that I think is so important to remember about history is that it's not just about, these grand narratives, right?
Yeah.
But it's also about the individual experiences of people from all walks of life. And so, the Homestead Act might have been this great opportunity for many, but for a married woman, it was still, you were still dependent on your husband. So it's really important to look at those individual stories and see how those played out.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes the American Yawp so interesting because they kind of bounce back and forth between these big ideas and these specific stories. And that's what I think makes history come alive. Because it's not just, names and dates, it's people.
It's people.
All right, so we've got all these people going west. They've got different motivations. They're coming from different backgrounds. And inevitably, you're going to have conflict. And the American Yawp dives into what they called, the Indian Wars. And,
Yeah.
and they emphasized that these weren't just like, isolated battles or skirmishes, but this was like a much larger and more tragic clash of cultures and, economic interests. So I guess the question is, what drove this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, at its core, you have two very different ways of life colliding. You have the expansion of American settlement, right, fueled by things like the Homestead Act, the railroads are coming in, and that is directly conflicting with the traditional ways of life of the Native American tribes who have been living there for centuries. And, Thomas Jefferson had this idea of peaceful coexistence between, white settlers and Native Americans, but that
Yeah.
really couldn't hold up under this kind of pressure, this westward surge. It was bound to lead to conflict.
It's like two, unstoppable forces almost
Yeah.
heading for a collision.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that, the American Yawp does so well is to kind of bring this conflict to life through these very specific stories. And one of the ones that really stood out to me was the Dakota War of 1862. I don't know if you remember this, but they have this quote in there from Andrew Myrick, who's a trader. And he basically says to, these Stark and Dakota people, let them eat grass.
Oh, chilling.
Yeah.
Really chilling.
And it says so much, I think, about the attitudes of the time.
It really captures that callous disregard that I think a lot of white Americans had for the suffering of Native Americans. And the Dakota Wars is a really harrowing example of the brutality that marked this era. You have the mass execution of 38 Dakota men, the forced removal of the Dakota people from their ancestral lands. I mean, it's a really dark chapter in American history.
Yeah. And it just makes me think about like how easily we can dehumanize people who are different from us.
Right.
To the point where we can say, let them eat grass. Like they're not even human in that moment.
Right.
And then of course you have, the Sand Creek Massacre where, a peaceful Cheyenne village is attacked and, over 200 men, women, and children are just slaughtered. And the American Yawp links this to, this growing fear and prejudice against Native Americans, which is fueled by events like the Dakota War.
Right.
So it's almost like this cycle of violence. Fear leads to violence. Violence leads to more fear. So I guess my question is, was there any attempt to address, this violence? Or was it just like, just kind of inevitable, this march of westward expansion?
Well, there were attempts, but they were often misguided. So, in response to these atrocities like the Sand Creek Massacre, Congress implemented something called the peace policy, which, on the surface sounds good. Who doesn't want peace?
Right.
But it was really heavily reliant on Christian missionaries to try to civilize Native Americans. So, while it sounds benevolent on the surface, the goal was to eradicate Native American cultures and force assimilation into white American society.
It's almost like, we're gonna help you by, basically
Like,
destroying everything that you are,
right.
and replacing it with our way of life.
Yeah, the kill the Indian, save the man mentality.
Wow. So, we talked about the Dakota War, we talked about the Sand Creek Massacre, and it seems like the stories of displacement and conflict just, they don't end there.
No, they don't.
The American Yawp takes us beyond, the plains to show what's happening with Native American groups, all across the West. And one of the stories that really kind of stuck with me was the Navajo Long Walk, where, these people are forced to march hundreds of miles to this desolate reservation, and, thousands die along the way. It's just, it's a testament to the Navajo people's resilience that they survived.
Yeah, the Long Walk is just one of, many, many examples of this systematic dispossession and marginalization of Native Americans. You also have the Modoc War, where, the Modoc people are driven from their land. They fight this fierce guerrilla war against the U.S. Army. They're defeated and their leaders are publicly executed. And then, of course, you have probably one of the most famous stories, the Nez Perce flight led by Chief Joseph. They try to flee to Canada to escape, being forced onto a reservation. And his surrender speech, "I will fight no more forever," is just, it's heartbreaking.
And I was reading about Chief Joseph. He was such a skilled leader, military strategist.
Yeah.
And it just seems like, the odds were just stacked against so many of these tribes.
Yeah, and I think that's the common thread that you see running through all these conflicts is this, it doesn't matter how skilled a leader you are, how brave your warriors are, ultimately you're up against, the U.S. Army, which is much larger, much better equipped, and has the backing of the entire federal government. So it's really a story of, how these different groups are just trying to survive in the face of this overwhelming force.
Right. And at the same time, you have the railroads, which are transforming the West, connecting the vast distances. And the American Yawp has this quote where, someone's saying that the West is purely a railroad enterprise.
Yeah, and you can't really argue with that when you look at the impact that the railroads had. They were really the backbone of the West's transformation. They made it possible to transport people, goods, resources on a scale that had never been seen before. And that fueled economic growth, connected the West to the rest of the country. But it also came at a steep price for Native Americans whose lands were often, carved up to make way for these railroads.
Right. It's like this symbol of progress, but also this symbol of destruction. And it just makes me think about, how often those two things go hand in hand. Progress for some often comes at the expense of others. And that's something that we still grapple with today. It's not just a 19th century issue. It's a very contemporary issue as well. So, we often picture cowboys on cattle drives when we think about the West.
Wisconsin.
But the American Yawp points out that, those drives were actually relatively short-lived. They were eventually replaced by, ironically, the very railroads that had initially made them necessary. And it's kind of cool to think about, those cowboys navigating these trails. They had the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Shawnee Trail. All these different trails. It must have been just, I can't even imagine what that life must have been like.
Yeah. Tough, dangerous, out in the elements for months at a time.
Yeah.
And it really captures, that romanticized image of the cowboy that we have, rugged individualism out there on the range facing the challenges of nature. But, it was a brief but significant chapter in the history of the West and ultimately, gave way to the forces of modernization.
Right.
Yeah.
Like those railroads. And those railroads weren't just about, transporting cattle. They fueled the growth of all sorts of other industries too, didn't they?
Absolutely. Mining, timber, agriculture, all of these industries boomed thanks to the railroads, because now they could get their products to market, across the country. And so you see the rise of these kind of hub cities, like
Yeah.
Chicago. Chicago becomes this massive center of commerce because it's connecting the East to the West. It's really, the railroads completely transform the economic landscape of the West.
So while all this is happening, all this economic expansion, the situation for Native Americans is, continuing to deteriorate.
Yeah.
As the frontier closes, that pressure to break up reservations and try to assimilate Native Americans into white society, I mean, it just intensifies. And that leads to the Dawes Act of 1887, which, as the American Yawp explains, was this attempt to, like, turn Native Americans into individual landowners. I mean, did this actually work? Did it work as intended?
No, it didn't. I mean, and it's almost like a classic example of good intentions gone wrong. On the surface, the idea was to give Native Americans land to help them become self-sufficient. But the problem was it was based on this assumption that Native Americans could just adopt, Euro-American farming practices and just kind of abandon their traditional ways of life. And the reality was far more complex than that. Native American cultures were so diverse and so tied to the land in different ways. And so the Dawes Act, instead of helping, really just led to the loss of millions of acres of Native American land. And it further eroded tribal sovereignty. So it's a prime example of how these well-intentioned policies can have devastating unintended consequences.
It's like this tragic pattern that we see repeated throughout history. Like this idea that, we know what's best for you and we're going to impose our way of life on you, even if it destroys everything that you hold dear. It's heartbreaking. So in the midst of all of this, you have this new spiritual movement that emerges, the ghost dance.
The ghost dance.
And I think that's a good place to pause for now.
All right.
We'll pick up the story of the ghost dance in our next episode.
Sounds good.
So the ghost dance, it was spreading like wildfire among all these Native American tribes.
Yeah.
And the American Yawp describes it. I mean, it was more than just a dance, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, much more. It was a spiritual movement, a response to, all of this hardship, all this loss that Native Americans were facing. And, the prophet Wovoka preached a message of peace, justice, and this idea that they could return to a world where their way of life would flourish again.
It's kind of heartbreaking, isn't it? This yearning for a world that was slipping away.
Yeah.
I mean, did it offer any real hope for change?
Well, the dance itself was peaceful, but it really frightened a lot of white settlers and government officials.
Interesting.
They saw it as a sign of rebellion, as a threat to their authority.
Okay. And that fear, that misunderstanding, ultimately led to the tragic events at Wounded Knee.
Yeah, Wounded Knee. The American Yawp describes it as a massacre.
It was.
The U.S. Army killing over 150 Lakota men, women, and children.
It's awful. Just a senseless act of violence.
Yeah, and it feels like this culmination of decades of conflict, broken promises.
Yeah, it's a real low point, I think, in American history.
And it makes you think about, like, how far we had strayed from that vision of, peaceful coexistence that Thomas Jefferson had talked about.
Oh, yeah. It's a far cry from that.
So, even as the West is being won, right, this very different image of the Wild West is starting to emerge in popular culture. And the American Yawp kind of takes us into this world of dime novels, Wild West shows, rodeos,
Yeah.
where figures like Calamity Jane and Billy the Kid, I mean, they become these larger-than-life legends.
Well, it's the power of myth-making, right?
Yeah. Even as the real West is being transformed by railroads and industry, you have this sort of romanticized, almost mythical version of the frontier that's taking hold in the American imagination.
And it's interesting to think about why. Like, why were people so drawn to this image of the West, even as they were creating this more complex, industrialized society?
Well, I think there's a couple of things at play here. I mean, on the one hand, you have this sense of nostalgia, right? People looking back on a simpler time, a time of adventure, of wide open spaces. And on the other hand, you have this anxiety about modernity, the rapid pace of change, the rise of cities, the loss of that connection to nature. And so the Wild West becomes this kind of escapist fantasy, a place where you can still be a rugged individual, where you can still tame the wilderness.
And those Wild West shows, I mean, with people like Buffalo Bill Cody and Annie Stokely, they must have just been, I mean, amazing spectacles.
Oh, absolutely. They were hugely popular. I mean, they had, shooting exhibitions, horseback riding, reenactments of famous battles. They even had, Native Americans performing in these shows.
Wow.
So it was this really kind of strange mix of entertainment and this sort of attempt to capture the spirit of the West. But of course, they weren't exactly accurate portrayals of history.
Right. So I guess it's fair to say they presented a very, very sanitized and, often inaccurate portrayal of what the West was really like.
Yeah, I mean, they reinforced all those stereotypes about cowboys and Indians. They romanticized a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. And the complex realities of westward expansion, the displacement of Native Americans, the environmental costs of progress, all of that was largely
Okay.
ignored.
So it's like this clash between the romanticized image and the much harsher realities. And it kind of makes you wonder, how do we reconcile those two versions?
Well, that's where historians come in, right? I mean, it's our job to examine the evidence, to challenge those myths, and to present a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the past.
Right. So I guess the American Yawp is a good example of how historians are trying to do that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really great resource for anyone who wants to learn about the history of the West.
And speaking of historians, the American Yawp introduces us to Frederick Jackson Turner and his, I guess, very famous frontier thesis.
Right.
I don't know if you could just take a minute to kind of explain to our listener, what is that and why is it so important?
Sure. So back in 1893, Turner presents this idea, this theory, that the frontier experience had fundamentally shaped American character. He argued that it fostered traits like individualism, democracy, a spirit of innovation. Basically, that the challenges of settling the frontier created this unique American identity.
So that's a pretty bold claim.
It is.
I mean, has his thesis held up over time?
Well, it was hugely influential, and it still resonates with a lot of people today. But it's also been criticized for its limitations.
Yeah.
And one of the big ones is that it largely ignores the contributions of non-white groups to the development of the West.
Right. So it's very much like a white-centric view of history.
Exactly. And it tends to romanticize westward expansion,
Oh.
overlooking, all of the violence, the exploitation, the environmental degradation that went hand in hand with it.
So it's kind of like we should take Turner's thesis with a grain of salt.
Yeah. It's a useful starting point for understanding, how Americans have viewed the West. But it's really important to remember that it's just one perspective.
Right.
And it's a flawed one at that.
Right.
We need to go beyond Turner, I think, to really grasp the true complexity of the West and its legacies.
And as we're kind of wrapping up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious, what are like some key takeaways that you hope our listener is pondering?
Well, I hope they're starting to see the history of the West as more than just a collection of dates and battles.
Right.
It's a story about, the clash of cultures, the struggle for resources, and the dreams and disappointments of people from all walks of life.
And it's a story that continues to shape us today, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we still grapple with issues of land rights, cultural identity, and that balance between progress and preservation that were so central to westward expansion.
I mean, the legacies of the West are all around us.
Yeah.
And by understanding this history, I think we can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the American story and the challenges that we still face as a nation.
As we've been talking about the West, I keep thinking about how diverse it really was. It wasn't just cowboys and Native Americans. The American Yawp really emphasizes how westward expansion involved so many different groups of people.
Yeah, that's a great point. The West drew in miners, ranchers, farmers, Mormons, immigrants from all over the world. I mean, it was this real melting pot of cultures and ambitions.
Yeah, and all those different groups didn't exist in isolation, right?
No, not at all. Their interactions really shaped the course of westward expansion.
Right, and I think, for example, we've talked a lot about the railroads and their impact,
Yeah.
but we haven't really touched on who was actually building those railroads. I mean, there were huge numbers of immigrant laborers involved, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. The railroads couldn't have been built without the backbreaking work of, thousands of immigrants, particularly from China and Ireland. I mean, they faced incredibly harsh conditions and widespread discrimination. And yet their contributions were, absolutely essential to transforming the West.
It's a reminder that the history of the West is also a story of immigration and, the pursuit of opportunity, even in the face of immense challenges.
Yeah. I mean, it's a story of, both the promise and the perils of the American dream, I guess you could say.
And thinking about these different groups and their motivations, I'm struck by how often their interests clashed.
Yeah.
I mean, take the Homestead Act, for instance.
Right.
I mean, it brought, hundreds of thousands of settlers west. But that inevitably led to conflict with Native American tribes who were already living on that land.
Right. The Homestead Act, while symbolic of opportunity for many, also intensified this competition for land and resources, and often with, tragic consequences for Native Americans.
It seems like the American Yawp is really encouraging us to see the West not as this simple, straightforward narrative,
Yeah.
but as this really intricate tapestry of interconnected stories.
Exactly. The West wasn't just a place. It was a process, a constant state of change and interaction between different cultures, ideas, and ambitions.
And if we want to truly understand it, we need to embrace that complexity
Mm,
and look beyond those romanticized versions that we so often encounter.
absolutely. I mean, that's the challenge for historians, right? To try to piece together this complex story and to help people understand it in all of its nuance.
So as we reach the end of our deep dive into the American West, I'm curious, what are some of the key things that you hope our listener will take away from this conversation?
Well, I hope they come away with a deeper appreciation for just the complexities of this period in American history. The West wasn't simply a land of cowboys and Indians. It was this dynamic, multifaceted society shaped by a wide range of forces,
Hmm.
economic, social, cultural, political. And I think, it's important to remember that this is a history that continues to shape our world today. The legacies of westward expansion, the treatment of Native Americans,
Hmm.
the exploitation of resources, the romanticization of frontier life. I mean, all of these things are still very much with us.
And it's up to us to learn from that history, right?
Absolutely. By grappling with those legacies and understanding how the past continues to influence the present, we can hopefully make more informed decisions about the future.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we have.
From, the bison hide industry to the ghost dance, from railroads to rodeos. What stands out to you as the most important thing for our listener to remember about the history of the American West?
I think just that it's a story that's much richer and more nuanced than the simple narratives that we often hear. It's a story that challenges us to think critically about our own assumptions and to really engage with the past in all of its complexity.
Well said. I think you've given our listener a lot to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the American West.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.